Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Visit us at our website, tertiumquids.org, and find out more about our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings and all of the policy work we're doing, certainly keeping an eye on the Virginia General Assembly as they continue to wrangle over Medicaid expansion. Kicking off this week's program, in an issue which, is puzzling to me in an abstract as well as in the specifics of it, is Heather McDonald. She is fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at City Journal as well, and she's got a great piece on free speech crisis on college campuses. Heather, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing this week?
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate being on.
Well, and I appreciate what you do here, and I don't know what generation you fall into, though I don't think it really makes a difference. But as somebody who grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I watched all the campus protests and realized that most of the people who are a little bit older than me are the grandparents of some of these folks who are willingly trying to quell free speech on campus. I don't know how they come to Thanksgiving dinner with these kids, but they seem proud of them for what they're doing in quelling free speech on a campus where they fought for free speech back in the 60s.
Well, that's because the real core issue that is driving all of this is victimology. We cannot solve the censorship problem unless we're willing to take on the preposterous conceit that to be a minority or a female on an American college campus today is to be the subject of relentless oppression, bias, and bigotry. Mm-hmm. And so the baby boomer parents, I think, are simply, to the extent that they support their children who are acting as these commissars of political orthodoxy, mm-hmm. are probably so filled with their own sense of righteousness in fighting phantom American racism that they don't really even mind the free speech suppression, because for them the ends justifies the means.
The sad thing is there are real places in the world where this kind of oppression is doctrine. It's written into the codes of these countries, and yet we seem to turn a blind eye to the human rights violations there, and look for imagined ones here. And it really is sad. I talked to some older gentlemen and women who worked through the civil rights movement of the 60s, and they feel, the honest ones I've spoken to, feel like this almost cheapens what they did, because what they were doing was trying to break up laws that, by code kept them from engaging in all the same activities Americans have. Now it just seems like we're looking for a sticker of approval from some government bureaucrat.
Well, the hypocrisy of the people on the left when it comes to alleged American bigotry and their silence on, as you say, the actual oppression around the world is stunning, and I've never heard a leftist address that issue. But, if you think that you're going to get away with a great gay pride march in Uganda or, trans rights in Afghanistan, good luck with that. And yet the most amazing thing to me is the completely contradictory message of the left that, say, the ACLU in the morning will be, putting out its usual loud message that America is the absolute pinnacle of hatred and discrimination mm-hmm. and white privilege and oppression. And then in the afternoon, it will be arguing for open borders and no consequences for any third world people of color who come to this country illegally. Well, why are the leftists so determined to bring in every single member of the world's poor into what they then claim is the absolute cauldron of hatred. Both positions can't be right.
Yeah. It's you'd think at one point they'd wake up and have to look at themselves in the mirror and either avert their eyes or admit what they see. Now you face this head on. Heather McDonald, you were called. Which college campus were you going to speak about a previous book that you had written, and then you faced this kind of suppression and softcore censorship firsthand. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I was on sort of a little mini speaking tour in California to talk about my book, The War on Cops, and first I gave a talk at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, that I could get through my remarks, but then after I finished talking, a bunch of students stormed the stage, grabbed the microphone, and there was a long battle that ensued as to whether I would be able to field questions from the audience and engage with them further. That was mild compared to what happened the next day when I went to Claremont McKenna College, which is a small liberal arts education that used to have a reputation for being conservative outside of Los Angeles. And there'd been a massive protest organized on Facebook to take down the fascist, racist Heather McDonald, and there was a student blockade around the building where I was supposed to speak that prevented anybody from entering the hall to hear me talk. The police let the students take over the building, and so I gave my remarks to an empty hall, and which was live streamed, and then people were pounding on the plate glass windows outside and chanting, and the police eventually decided that it was too dangerous, and they escorted me out through the kitchen to a waiting police car.
You'd wonder if some of the women's rights marchers wouldn't have come to your defense at least. I know it's almost funny. Hold on, what's happening here? What have we? And I guess that's what it comes down to is nobody wants to engage in a discussion about, hey, here's what I think the right way forward. Here's the other way. If I don't agree with you, it's my right to, or my responsibility to shout you down. We watch this with congressional town halls. Nobody wants to have a discussion with their congressional representative. They want to shout them down so that nobody can hear anything and all that's seen on the news. And that's where I really think this comes down to is that they want to be seen on the news as shouting whatever epithets at the congressman in question is, or the author, or the speaker in general, and that's what winds up on the news rather than the message of whatever event was going on.
That could be that there's, this is just a push for publicity. I think, at least on college campuses, that students sincerely believe in this ridiculous claim that they are victims, and that speech that is unorthodox, that challenges campus orthodoxies, is quite literally a threat to the existence of minority students. I mean, they're leveraging an extremely maudlin, narcissistic rhetoric of self-pity and self-involvement, and so arguably, even if there weren't TV cameras or something being videoed, I think that these student protests at least would continue because of the moral righteousness and the utter ignorance of students with regards to their extraordinary privilege in being a college student, and just certainly their ignorance of history and what has preceded this remarkable idea of free speech.
You said something just there that I think touches this, and I want to ask you your impression of what seems to be coming of this is this idea that we have to create a minority group that we belong to, a targeted group of something. And as this has gone on for 4 or 5 years, growing and growing and growing, we're watching more and more people trying to create splinter groups of societal minorityism. I'm left-handed. I'm tone deaf. I'm colorblind. I mean, it's getting to the point where just as an effort to get any attention, we all have to create a minority group that we can belong to.
That's absolutely right. It is a desperate competition out there for most favored victim status, and that's certainly what's behind the whole trans movement, because being gay on campus now is old hat. It doesn't carry any kind of transgressive qualities to it, and so students are desperate for some way to draw attention to themselves, to claim the biggest demands on the student services bureaucracy, the most diversity bureaucrats, to cater to their whining, preening claims of injury. And it is an extremely, to be the top victim in our society is to be top dog. And, frankly, everybody gets so upset, and we have this whole academic field now of whiteness and white privilege studies, and the claim that white people are the absolute bane of human existence. And you have well-meaning conservatives and people like Ben Shapiro, whom I respect enormously, complaining about white identity politics. Well, the problem is, and of course the left goes nuts, and it's white identity politics is a trivial drop in the bucket, but one does have to ask, with everybody else claiming group status, it is going to be the case that there are going to be some whites who say, well, we are a specific group as well, and I don't know the logic of stopping that. I mean, the left would say, well, only white people can be racist. By definition,
I've heard it.
You cannot be a bigot if you're not white. That's completely wrong.
But that's the narrative.
We are becoming very balkanized.
Well, here in our flagship city of Charlottesville, which has almost become an adjective for that kind of behavior, we saw it bubble over in this Unite the Right rally, which wasn't right at all, really National Socialists, but
right.
We're looking for that white group that could get some attention as well, and we see it. Heather, is it dangerous to dismiss this as just the fruit of the everybody gets a trophy generation? I've heard people say that. I see the sociological impact on a macro, but I don't want to trivialize this because I think it gets worse before it gets better. But is there some truth to that as we raised a generation thinking just participating is enough to get a trophy, that now they're just looking for new ways to get trophies?
No, that's a very naive view. This is ideological, and I also disagree respectfully with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, who argue comparably to what you're saying, that this is sort of snowflakes that have been over helicopter parented, that it's a cycle. This attack on free speech and the victimology is a psychological problem. I argue that it's an ideological problem. This is really a self-conscious attack on Western ideals, on American European culture, and it certainly is. And I am not a white supremacist, but let's be honest, it is definitely an attack on whites. The response to that should not be, some kind of white nationalist politics. But it is going to the extent that this type of demonizing of whites and white males in particular continues, there is going to be some sort of reaction. And it's also not the case that this is something that ends at college campuses. The type of preposterous left-wing belief that again, to be a female or a minority in America is to be the victim of constant discrimination, whereas in fact the opposite is the case. That is now entering workplace culture enormously. We saw that with the firing of James Damore at Google last summer in August for questioning Google's radical feminist ideology. It's not staying put on campuses. The public has to really wake up and see what's happening. If they're an alumnus, college alumnus, for heaven's sake, stop shoveling money into your college unless you are completely certain that it is free of this identity politics poison, because it is going to destroy America.
Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald, also contributing reporter and author for City Journal, and author of the book The War on Cops, chronicling her censorship at the college campus level. Is there, and I've heard this rhetoric used in city council meetings and on up, as we look into places like South Africa where their Congress just voted in constitutional reparations, confiscations of private property based around the idea of giving it back to somebody, that this battle against the white supremacy of American history could lead us into a very dangerous place where reparations and things like that and property confiscations happen?
Well, yes. I mean, reparations, voluntary, but I think, yeah, you could have confiscations. I think that we are toying with a race war. We are creating in educated black students a degree of hatred and resentment that is very, very scary. It is constant. You know, there is an entire college bureaucracy that is dedicated to the proposition that the black students on campus are under threat. And it's not just college bureaucrats. This is starting in many, many high schools and elementary schools across the country that have the same message of white privilege and white oppression. And we are really playing with fire here. It could get very, very ugly.
Well, you mentioned that, and I'm struck by what happened to Robespierre after he engineered the first parts of the French Revolution, only to lose his own political and physical head in the matter. Once he had gained the power, he didn't keep it. And you talk about playing with fire. I watched the political class in America on the left fanning these flames for their own political position, but it could very easily, as you say, blow up in their faces.
Well, and it does. It's the only thing that is occasionally satisfying about colleges is when a so-called progressive professor has the ire of the left turned against him for making some little modestly commonsensical comment. And, people who are otherwise quite sympathetic, like two professors at Yale who have a whole history of progressive sociology and psychology, that were the husband was subjected to 3 hours of the most atrocious verbal abuse and almost physical threats by a mob of students. I've never seen such appalling behavior in my life, simply because his wife, another Yale professor, had dared to suggest that students could choose their own Halloween costumes without oversight from the college's diversity bureaucrats.
Amazing.
These are left wingers, and yet they were being denounced as racist themselves.
Well, we see it here as some of our elected bodies are being confronted by, far leftists. The leftists that hold the office are being told they're not far enough left by reparational socialists. And, we see we just had a matter. Charlottesville is a big college town, and their Democratic Party held a caucus in which only 13 members of the black community showed up because after 50 years of being lied to, they've gone to find somebody else to listen to. And I'm afraid it's actually the farther left socialists than the standard run of the mill Lyndon Johnson Great Society Democrat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I know that I'm constitutionally a pessimist, so that needs to be taken into account. But I really am very worried.
So where
people have to start telling the truth about the fact that Americans want to get along. I mean, white people do not bear a grudge against blacks. We have a terrible history in this country, an appalling history, an absolute betrayal of our principles. And for decades, for centuries, we're actually involved in a deliberate effort to subjugate blacks. That is absolutely the case. Things have changed radically, though. Most people simply want to get along. They don't care about race. Most workplaces are actually pretty harmonious. You can see blacks and whites working together, especially in places like police departments, uniformed services.
The military, yeah, absolutely.
A lot of camaraderie, and yet we're supposed to believe that whites are on this mission to keep blacks down. It's just not true. And unless people are willing to stand up and say, to the contrary, I can say this for sure, to be a female in society today, far from being the subject of misogyny, as a female, I know that I have been the so-called recipient of preferences constantly, gender preferences. Males are being disfavored in favor of females, and that is true for blacks being given enormous racial preferences to the disadvantage of whites and Asians. So far from being systemically racist, we are now systemically preferential in our behavior.
Does game plan it out a little bit, Heather? I'll let you go. I appreciate your insight on this, having seen it and studied it. Does this go to the point where it starts to get ridiculous, where it becomes left on left, and then it kind of breaks up in the lack of being able to build a coalition, or does it turn really bad where we have almost 60s style torching of neighborhoods and things like that?
Yeah, I think it could easily get that bad. I maybe the only change from the 60s is that the establishment now is the left. You think of, say, the whole Silicon Valley elites. They don't want their neighborhoods torched. And so they now have a stake in private property rights as much as they disparage them sort of ideologically. So whether that will serve as an ultimate check on this, I don't know. But this has been going on for a long time, and it's not getting any better. It gets worse, and you always think it can't get worse, and it does get worse.
Heather, I appreciate everything you've done in and up and to this point, and thank you for taking some time out with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you. I've got a book coming out in September on this topic called The Diversity Delusion. Oh, okay. It was September, you said? We'll mark it down, and we'll definitely have you back before it comes out in there. And will it be, traditional downloads, but also traditional paperback, hardcover, everything? Great. I think it can be pre-ordered now on Amazon. And what was it titled again? The Diversity Delusion. Look it up on Amazon. Get that pre-order in. Thank you so much, Heather. We appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and as we continue on this week's program, joining us now from the Pacific Research Institute, Wayne Winegarden, and a report they've done called the 15% Solution. You may have heard, and there's some buzz going on amongst conservatives that the president worries them, I guess, that he seems less than monastic when it comes to government infrastructural support and spending. But I want to find out what Wayne has in this report. It's thank you very much. Beyond the New Normal is the title of the report, and I guess there's no better title for these days. Wayne, thank you for joining us on the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all, not at all. So let's talk about the omnibus, the spending plans, the infrastructure. The president has laid out some fairly broad brushstroke rhetoric regarding infrastructural spending and improving and upgrades and those kind of things. So talk about your 15% solution, defining the affordable level of government. Is there, I guess that's one of those debates that conservatives get caught up with. Is there an affordable level of government? What is too much government? And what is appropriate infrastructural support?
Absolutely. I think the impetus for all of kind of our research going into this issue really goes back to Milton Friedman, and I think anytime you start with Professor Friedman, it's got to go someplace good.
Sure.
He used to say government spending is government taxation, and I think that's the right way of thinking about it, right? So that we have an excessive amount of spending, which means we have an excessive amount of taxation. And if we make the assumption, kind of like the Laffer curve, that the government spending shouldn't be zero, and we certainly know that it shouldn't be as high as it is now, how much should it be? We always talk about cutting spending, but we wanted to kind of start getting to the question of cutting spending to where, right? What is the right size of government? And then once we can think about the right size of government kind of interrelatedly, and this gets to your infrastructure issue, what should we be spending on?
Right.
And I think those are the kind of the questions we need to be asking as we start to, I think, right-size government and bring it to that efficient level. And so that was the purpose of the report. And so we went through and started figuring out what seems to be the right size. And that's the 15% solution.
It is something that as a conservative we talk about. A society, and a society has underpinnings. A society has roads. A society has infrastructure for electrical distribution, sewage treatment, those sorts of things that we're not going to do unless we're in an extremely rural area on an individual basis. And I guess that's where some of the conflict in the conservative circles begins, is this idea that maybe because we've gone so far off of one end that we're trying to overcorrect maybe and pull us back to a place where we don't spend anything on anything for too long?
And I think the most important thing kind of in that whole debate is you were saying pull back. And I think that's a great way of framing it. We want to pull back spending to the right level, impose really a hard budget constraint. I mean, we have this illusion that if government spends money, I don't think most conservatives have it, but you see it in the press all the time, that we need to stimulate the economy, so we'll have the government spend money. Never asking the question, well, is that the best use of the resources? Because in order for the government to spend money, they've got to take it from someplace else.
Right.
And so what you need to think about is, okay, if you have no government, an example we use in the paper is, imagine a town with no firehouses. Right. Building that first firehouse, you've got to imagine, improves the welfare of the town.
Sure.
Right. Because now we have professionals that can put out the fire. But building the 20th firehouse, well, now you're just wasting money and making the town worse off. And so we're at the point where we have 20 firehouses, and what we're arguing is, well, we think about 7 or 8 might be the right number of firehouses. Let's bring the government back down to having 8 firehouses, not to having 20.
You mentioned something that rings a familiar phrase in my head, Wayne. It is the presumption of precedent. So you're okay with the first firehouse, so you therefore have to be okay with the 20th one. And that seems to be our governmental malaise sometimes is, well, what do you mean you don't want us building this highway now? You were fine with the first 20. And I guess that's a great way to put it. And I appreciate you doing that, because I don't think I've ever heard it put quite this way. Is you can be okay with the first school. It's the 20th one that can be over the top. So how did you do the Friedman-esque, Laffer-esque curve to come to 15%? Because it sounds a little bit like where we were in the sweet spot of the flat tax discussions. What is the government's requirement? What should we have? How did you get to 15%?
Well, one thing that kind of confirmed kind of our own numbers that we were running is when we were looking at some other studies that have done this. I was not the first person to come up with this idea, nor the first person to kind of try to empirically look at it. And they had very similar numbers in terms of how large the government should be relative to the economy. And so when we looked at it, we actually looked at it as the economy excluding depreciation. So it's not actually GDP; it's actually national income. If we're going to be technical for a second,
sure.
And so what we do in a regression estimation, kind of a technical term there, but we did our analysis with the data over about 50, 60 years worth of data, and kind of controlling for other variables that are out there. We found that the optimal range was somewhere between 14 to 16% of national income. And when that was consistent with a lot of the previous findings, we felt very confident that there's something to, something around that level. But I wouldn't say 15% is magical. If it was 17%, if it was 13%, it's bringing it to that area. For perspective, right now we're at 24% of national income. So we're about 80% too high relative to that range. And so there's certainly nothing magical about 15%, although I think it makes a very persuasive kind of marketing pitch, right? 15% solution.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the importance of getting us closer to that range where we have a hard budget cap, just like every other organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a family, right? We all have budgets we have to live in, and we prioritize our spending because we know we can't kind of spend as much as we want. And so you actually end up with a higher quality of spending once you know that, wait a second, if we spend our money here, we won't be able to go, if we go to the concert tonight, we can't go out for brunch tomorrow. Which one's more important to us? It's those types of trade-offs that we have to start kind of forcing on the government to help reduce waste, reduce programs that are no longer effective.
Is there a danger, and I've been somewhat of a prickly pear when it comes to people who talk about democracy versus the representative republic we were supposed to have. And one of the real problems I've found is classically, and I think this is what Madison saw, is that the democracies collapsed under economic stress because that spending became not so much just but preferential. We all want things to be spent on what we want them to be spent on, and if we say 15%, I wonder if we as society would still insist that 15% be spent on the things that I think are important, not what Wayne thinks is important. And that's one of those dangers. We need to get back to a place where it's not necessarily something that, what's the right phrasing on this, that we all get something for our money. We all feel like, I've given you 15% of my wages. What am I getting out of it? And that pretext sometimes, I think, is what drives politicians to say, I'll spend something on what you think is important. Just vote for me next time. And we teeter on this spot, Wayne. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think it's a fair thing to say, and I think that's a problem that is consistent that we face no matter what the situation is. And so if we put a hard budget constraint, at least if we're going to spend on your preferences or we're going to spend on my preferences, if the politician's going to do that, if they're going to help you, they've got to hurt me. And so at least by imposing a budget constraint, we can start to kind of have a cost on those types of trade-offs that politicians always engage in terms of vote buying or whatever the case may be. I think that's one of the issues that when you implement kind of in the kind of a democratic system, we always are stuck with.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's, I think, one of the importance of having a hard budget constraint is that it forces a trade-off. Because right now what they do, and I think the omnibus bill that Congress just passed exemplifies it, right? The Republicans felt more defense expenditures were necessary. Democrats felt that more social expenditures were necessary, and so they compromised and did more of both. Mm-hmm. If we had a hard budget cap, we would force a trade-off. You want defense expenditures, we're going to have to fight it off, and we can't do more social spending. If you want to do more social spending, then we need to cut back on military expenditures, and now we have preferences that will be fought off in the political arena, but we won't get more of both, which we can't afford.
Wayne,
so I think that's why we think the budget constraint, a hard budget constraint, is so important.
You remind me of something now Dean of the Liberty University Center for Political Studies, Robert Hurt, said upon his first year in the U.S. House of Representatives. He said, in Virginia, when we compromise, you get some of what you want and I get some of what I want. In Washington, you get everything you want and I get everything I want, and that's compromise. And that's what it sounds like there. What about some of the proposals? Bob Goodlatte from Virginia's 6th District has regularly brought a balanced budget amendment, and he's tweaked it over the years to include some GDP triggers so that we just don't automatically use it as an excuse to raise taxes. Oh, we have to have the balanced budget, so just have to raise taxes to reach this number of percentages of GDP. What do you think of proposals like that if they were to come in to play? Or would they be used as an excuse, just sort of like sequester was, which seems similar to some of the stuff you were talking about?
Yeah, the gamesmanship is so kind of important to control. So that's why, balanced budget amendment without the hard cap becomes an excuse for higher taxes. So we definitely need some sort of cap so we can't have those games. And then just because we get that policy victory, I think we always have to be vigilant for the exact reasons that you're talking about. There's always the gamesmanship to see how can we get around kind of those caps. We can move this off budget, or we can kind of, we'll have a sequester, but we'll only kind of work on this part of the budget. So entitlement spending, that can grow as much as we need. I mean, so you have all of those games to work around kind of the attempts to control spending. And so I think the simpler we make the controls, it makes it harder to kind of come up with a creative way around it, right? Once you start getting a complex control system, then you can have some sort of lawyer come in and redefine spending as investments, and all of a sudden it doesn't apply, right? So we need a broad-based, simple way to cap spending, and in that way we can minimize the controls. But ultimately, nothing can substitute for a vigilant public that demands responsibility. And if we're not vigilant, politicians will find a way to work around it. And so that's the importance of always being vigilant.
Wayne, our founder, John Taylor, joined me for some of the very first Tea Party movement rallies in 2009 on April 15th, where I found Democrats, Libertarians, Republicans all gathered around the idea of the acronym taxed enough already. And almost immediately, what I guess now has colloquially been described as the swamp went to work on marginalizing those who were part of that group as crazy and zealots and kooky, and they're wearing strange hats, and they want to reenact the Boston Tea Party, and that wasn't anything about it. It was taxed enough already, and it was a very simple message, what I think went across a lot of party lines, and it seems to go into what your Pacific Research Institute report, the 15% solution, says. You talk about in your report that currently government spending, state, local, federal, is about 40 cents out of every dollar we make. And I think most people would say, whoa, that's only leaving me 60 cents out of every dollar I earn to pay for what I need, my rent, my car repairs and things like that. And I think when you put it that way, I think it's a winning argument. Have you found that as you distribute this report that people start saying, hold it, that's way too much money to spend?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you start also adding in the fact that 40 cents of every dollar doesn't include, the debt and the cost of the debt.
True.
And that doesn't include the cost of Social Security and Medicare and the unfunded kind of pensions for government workers. I mean, so, that number is actually an understatement of what the costs are. And so I think absolutely, it's one of those things where, if you just ask an open question, people are like, yeah, sure, a little bit more taxes, and that's no big deal. But then when you start to give the information, well, did you know that in California, the top federal, state, and local tax rates are almost 50%? Do you think taxes should be raised? You get a different answer because you give people the perspective that,
right,
hey, wait a second, we're already spending an incredible amount of money. We're already have a very kind of burdensome tax system. And part of what we were also hoping to do was exactly in terms of your point where you I think can have a natural connection across parties especially when we start saying we're not talking about eliminating the government. We're saying the government has a very valuable function, but that function is valuable when it plays its proper role, and that proper role is much smaller than what it's doing right now. And so we create hopefully kind of a reasonable position where people across parties can come together and say, okay, this is where the positive role government plays. This is when it plays a positive role. And the problem now is that we've just far exceeded it. And whenever you have excessive consumption of anything, right, you go out for a meal and eat too much, you start to get a stomach ache. And it's just as simple as that.
Right, and you also have less money to go out to lunch tomorrow when you're actually maybe hungry again. and I guess that's what it comes further to, Wayne, and Wayne Winegarden from the Pacific Research Institute, and his 15% solution is when people look at what government is doing with the money, I've compared it in some instances to an investment firm, like a venture capital firm, and we hear governors and state representatives especially, and even to a degree the president say, we must invest in this business, or we must invest in this. And if I give money to a venture capitalist, I have some say over what businesses and what enterprises they're investing in. And if I don't like what they're doing or it isn't returning on my investment, I pull my money out and they go under. A government doesn't have that concern. So we really need to rein in this idea that the government is the venture capitalist of default these days.
Oh, absolutely. It seems like a slight incentive, but it makes all the difference in the world. If you don't have your own skin in the game, your actions are going to be vastly different. And that's the problem. Whenever you talk about government being kind of a venture capitalist, right, Solyndra being such the obvious example, you just aren't going to have the same due diligence over it. It makes all the difference in the world. You're also riskier. You're going to be much riskier on when you're spending other people's money than when you're spending your own money, and you'll be risky in a sense where it's irresponsible, and that's where you end up with a lot of the venture capitalist kind of mistakes. And then you also have the bureaucratic problems. Even in the private sector, most innovations don't come from large corporations.
No,
right? Innovations come from the small entrepreneur experimenting, and then the large corporation buys them out because they're good at efficient at production of making things
scaling
efficient,
up,
but not good at creative. So large organizations also aren't good at identifying creative solutions and making those happen. So you have all those disincentives working against the government as a venture capitalist. It's just not what their role is.
Isn't there also an inverse to that as well? A lot of companies look at the government as a way to protect their market share from those innovators, and I find that some of our American innovation has dulled because the big companies have legislated somewhat of a barrier to entry for some of those young innovators that nip at the heels. And in some cases, like you said, the big company will eventually buy them out. But even the tech companies are starting to get that old school industrialist, if I got a friend in Washington, now I don't have to worry about the competition.
Oh, absolutely. And that goes back to Adam Smith, 1776, where he actually said, you don't get people in the same industry together, even for merriment, before they start trying to figure out how they can restrain trade. So, that's always, again, and that's the more we control the size of government, the less opportunity there are for those types of engagementships. And so as we kind of reduce those opportunities, we create a more vibrant economy, and you force the large corporations to embrace the innovation and to buy the innovators. We want to disincent the large companies from being able to block competition through the political process, make them compete in the market, and if there's a better idea out there, they can go either imitate it or buy it. But that's the way it should work.
What has in the few moments we have left, Dr. Winegarden, what has the distribution of your report been? Many of our listeners have friends who hold elected office, and I hope they download the report from our links on our social media, or they go to pacificresearch.org for it. But have you shared this with other elected officials, and what has their reaction been to it?
Yeah, we're just beginning the distribution process so far. The response, I think, has been quite positive. We've been giving it to legislative leaders, distributing it down in Washington, D.C. We have a nice little video up on our website that our Director of Communications, Tim Anaya, produced, which is just fantastic. So we're trying to get the word out. And this is part of a series that we've been looking at, and we're actually going to, in the next phase of this research, we're going to start actually getting into the details of, there's a lot of great research out there that talks about what type of spending we can do, what type of entitlement reforms. So we're going to start bringing that research together to start coming up with, if this is the 15% solution, well, what are the actual cuts that we can do that can bring us to that level? And it certainly should be done over time, right? We can't just instantaneously cut that much out of a budget. That's just not the way you can do things like that in large organizations. You do it slowly, deliberately over time, bringing us to that right level. And so that's kind of the next phase of our research is, what should we be cutting?
Dr. Winegarden, thank you so much for your visit, and we'll have to have you back as that starts coming out as well, because it is a process we need to undertake. Thank you very much for your work, and everybody at the Pacific Research Institute, and thank you for your time this week.
Oh, thank you. Have a great one.
Thank you for listening, and until next week, for all of us here, so long, and thanks for all the fish.